Hello and welcome to lesson number 16 of our continuing exploration of the prophecies in the book of Daniel in a study that I have called the Daniel Factor in the Fullness of Time. And in these series of lessons, I have been examining just how the book of Daniel factors into God's overall plan to bring about humanity's ultimate redemption and restoration, which will ultimately occur when Christ returns and establishes his kingdom here on earth at some point yet to be determined in the future. Now, in today's study, we will be looking at Daniel chapter 11, which is a continuation of the final vision recorded in the book of Daniel, which began in chapter 10. In chapter 11, we will be seeing the specific details of this final vision. And in this study of chapter 11, because of the nature of the time gap that we will see in the vision, I'm going to have to divide this chapter into two sessions. In this first session, by the way, of Daniel chapter 11, we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 35, which the heavenly messenger describes the events that literally occurred during the 400-year time gap, or the 400-year period in between the testaments, or between the closing of the Old Testament canon and the opening of the New Testament. Now, in our last lesson, in which we were introduced to this final vision in chapter 10, we learned that this final vision that includes chapters 10 through 12 contain three main ideas that God will reveal to Daniel by giving him even more progressive details about previous prophecies. Now, first of all, we're going to see a glimpse into, or Daniel is going to be given a glimpse into Israel's near future, or he's going to be given additional layers of details about events surrounding Antiochus Epiphanes, whom we were first introduced to in Daniel chapter 8. Then we saw more progressive details as we began to look at Daniel 10 about the far future of the nation of Israel to the time of the Antichrist. By the way, Antiochus was a type of. And finally, and maybe even most importantly, in our examination of chapter 10, we got to see a glimpse into what I call the dark side, or that invisible or the unseen spirit world. And we saw firsthand that we truly are not battling against flesh and blood, but instead we are in a spiritual battle with principalities and rulers of darkness. In other words, chapter 10 gave us a peek into the heart of this spiritual warfare, where we saw the holy angel and the archangel Michael fighting a supernatural battle in the unseen realm against the demon prince of Persia, in which both sides were battling to influence King Cyrus. And in the end, King Cyrus made the right decision to stand by his royal decree to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, because the rebuilding of the temple was crucial to future prophetic events. And that is beside the fact that he was the one who signed the decree, and the decree that allowed the children of Israel to return back to rebuild the temple in the first place. And that decree represented the conclusion of the 70-year captivity of Judah in Babylon. So in other words, there is a war going on in the unseen realm that literally impacts much of what we see occurring today in the natural realm. Or more simply put, much of what we're seeing happening in the natural world was first orchestrated in the spiritual realm and then manifested in the natural. But even more specifically, Daniel 10 revealed to us that there are specific spiritual beings that are ruling over and directly influencing the nations of planet Earth. So And with that background and with that review in mind, let's jump in to Daniel chapter 11. Before we get into today's lesson, I need to mention that if you would like more information about our ministry and more information about some of the things that we have taught or the teachings that we do or how to get in touch with us, you can reach out to me or you can check me out at my webpage at www.drbrucelogan.com or bruceloganministries.com. You can also follow me on Facebook at DBL Ministries. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. or Dr. Bruce Logan 1. That's Dr. Bruce Logan 1 on Twitter. And you can also email me at br2logan@aol.com. And of course, you want to remind you that if you would like to receive notifications about whenever a new video comes online, I would like to encourage you to just click the like button and click the bell in order to be reminded when the next lesson of this series will be made available. Now, the prophecies in chapter 11 are thought to be the most detailed and the most thorough prophecies in the entire book of Daniel. And in addition to being the most detailed and the most thorough, Daniel 11 also spans over the largest period of time, because the prophecies of Daniel 11 span from Alexander's conquest of Persia to the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, and all the way into the future to the rise and fall of the Antichrist. And what is also significant about Daniel 11 is that the period described had a direct impact and influence on the world of the New Testament that Christ was born into. In other words, when the pages of the Old Testament closes, at the end of the book of Malachi, Judah was back in their homeland after 70 years of captivity. Hebrew had returned to become the common language. Solomon's temple had been rebuilt after being destroyed by the Babylonians, and Persia was the dominant world empire. Amazingly, however, fast forwarding 400 years into the beginning of the New Testament era, there had been some radical changes in the religious, social, and political environment of the nation of Israel. We see, for an example, such sweeping changes as Greek was now the dominant language instead of Hebrew. There were these competing religious sects like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The land of Israel had been divided up into provinces, and the Jews were under the control of a new dominant world power called Rome, who had placed military governors over the various provinces and were renowned for their road construction projects that they were roads that were built throughout all of their territories. Now, these roads, of course, were designed or their primary purpose was for military transport and also for easy commerce. But now all of these radical changes, which add such profound impact on the religious, social, and political environment that Christ was born into, the question that every astute Bible student should immediately ask themselves is, well, what happened? How exactly did the world of the New Testament get to this point? And it is this period and these events that led to these radical changes that is described in minute detail in Daniel chapter 11. Now, interestingly, most of these events occurred during the 400-year gap between the Old and the New Testaments, or between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew. Many historians and scholars, incorrectly I might add, refer to this period as the 400 silent years. It is often called the silent years because God was not actually speaking through a prophet during those years. Now, however, while this period is often referred to as the 400 years of silence, in reality, during this period, God had not given up on humanity, neither was he silent or asleep. nor was he just ignoring what was happening here on earth. Instead, God was still yet clearly, specifically, and providentially at work. In other words, instead of working through a prophet or speaking through a prophet as in previous times, during this 400-year period, God was instead working through history, providentially preparing the world stage for the coming of his son. In other words, like a conductor orchestrating a great symphony, God was providentially orchestrating historical events in a way that would eventually set the stage or lay the groundwork for the birth of his son. This, in fact, is specifically what Paul was referring to in Galatians when he wrote the theme that we have centered this entire study around, which is Galatians 4 and 4 through 5, that says, but when the set time had fully come, or when the fullness of time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem us under the law, that we might receive the adoption of son. In other words, when all of the prophetic dots were dotted and all the prophetic T's were crossed, just as prophesied in Daniel chapter 11, and all the events that were literally fulfilled specifically and literally as described in Daniel chapter 11, God said, this was now time to send my son into the world. In other words, God was preparing the way or setting the world stage for the major prophetic milestone fulfillment of the coming of his son into the world. Remember, we spoke or taught earlier that in the flow of Bible prophecy, there's always prophetic milestones, which are major prophetic fulfillments, which of course Christ being born in Bethlehem was a major fulfillment or a major prophetic milestone fulfillment. But in order for that major milestone fulfillment to have taken place, there had to be a series of prophetic stepping stones that prepared the way or led the way or set the stage for that prophetic milestone to be fulfilled. And it's important to keep in mind, and it's important that I stick a pin here and emphasize that, because whenever a prophetic milestone occurs in history, it never happens randomly or just out of the blue, but there is always a series of events or stepping stones that I like to refer to them as, that set the stage for and led or prepared the way for the major prophetic milestone. Now, this 400-year gap between the testaments should be more accurately be called, and because God was preparing the way, I should add, by the way, because God was purposely and deliberately preparing the way, this 400-year period, instead of being called the 400 silent years, should more accurately be referred to as the period of preparation. In fact, I often kind of scoff whenever I hear the term silent years. And I know that, many historians and scholars, they mean well and, don't really mean anything by it. And it's just a catchphrase or a common term that has caught on down through the centuries. But literally, God was preparing the way. This period should be called the period of preparation because God was actually preparing the world stage for the coming of his son. Now, as we will discover in more detail as we begin our examination of the prophecies of Daniel 11, God, as I've been reiterating, was literally preparing the world stage for the birth of his son and the spread of the gospel. And that's important to keep in mind because, as I mentioned previously about the Roman roads, the gospel, much of the gospel was spread, or many of the apostles and prophets and the early Christians spread the gospel by traveling on those Roman roads that did not exist prior to the Romans coming into power. Now, to put it more succinctly, it was key historical events that God providentially orchestrated that set the stage or prepared world history. The whole, keep in mind that the entire Roman world in which the gospel was being spread was Greek speaking, and that was literally because of the work and exploits and the result of the conquest of Alexander the Great. Now, and for the political, geographical, historical, social, and religious environment that Christ was born into, this prepared time, or this period of time, prepared the way or set the stage. So in other words, when you open up the pages of the New Testament, and in fact, I often teach New Testament studies, and I always start before I even get into the New Testament, before I even get into teaching the Gospels and teaching the book of Matthew, I spend sometimes a week to 2 weeks talking about this period of preparation that set the stage, because by understanding what happened during this period, it helps us to understand who were the Sadducees, who were the Pharisees, why was the world Greek speaking, and so forth. And by understanding this period, which is really broken down into detail in Daniel 11, it gives us a better insight into the study of the New Testament. Now, this 400-year period between the Testament for the Jewish people was characterized by 400 years of subjugation between multiple nations, first Persia, then the Greeks, and then, of course, the Romans. And it was also characterized by a lot of oppression and a tremendous amount of corruption. But during this period, we see several things that occurred, or several groups that rose during this period that are prominent as the New Testament unfolds. For an example, we saw the rise of the synagogues occur during this 400-year period. The Old Testament canon was established. The rule of law was reestablished and also corrupted, by the way. Corruption of the high priesthood took place. The Greek Septuagint was translated during this time. The rise of the Sadducees occurred. And then the rise of the Pharisees, who were separatists, also occurred. And then we saw the rise of Hasidic Judaism, or those who opposed Hellenization. And finally, the Herod's Temple project began, or was undertaken by King Herod under this period of time. Now, as we begin to get into Daniel chapter 11, I like to refer to Daniel 11, or give it a title, Back to the Future, because when we're looking at Daniel 11, it goes back and talks about several centuries of events that literally took place already in past history. But then it fast forwards and it gives us a glimpse into the distant future of events that are still awaiting fulfillment at some point in the future, in the last days. And so that's the reason why I like to call Daniel 11 Back to the Future, and which is part 2. Remember, we're talking about the final vision that was given in the book of Daniel that covers Daniel's chapters 10 through 11, and the main part of the vision is given to us here in Daniel chapter 11. So now in Daniel 11, 2 through 45, basically has a 5-part breakdown. First of all, we get a re-examination, or a quick overview back to the prophecy of Daniel 8 of the ram and the goat, which is Alexander's conquest of Persia. And then we get a synopsis or study of the kings of the north and the south, and more specifically Syria versus Egypt, in verses 5 through 20, and we'll talk about who they were going forward. And then we get into the madman, or Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember, we were first introduced to him in Daniel chapter 11. And of course, in today's study, we're going to conclude with chapter 11, verse 35. But as chapter 11 continues, we'll see the last king, who will be the Antichrist, who is yet to take place or yet to arise at some point in the future, all the way to the millennial kingdom. And remember, we noted earlier that the time span of Daniel chapter 11 covers the most period of time, because it covers from Alexander's conquest of Persia all the way to the Antichrist and to the millennial kingdom. And finally, we want to be get as a main objective for this study, and for that the thing that we want to get out of Daniel chapter 11 is to reaffirm that God knows the end from the beginning and is in complete and total control of all of history, including, and I want to reemphasize this, including the days and the times and the events that are occurring in our world right now. The events that are occurring in our world right now are not events that are just happening in a vacuum. Events are being controlled and orchestrated, all for the purpose of setting the stage, laying out stepping stones for the major milestone of the return of Christ. Now, that is so important that we not lose sight of that, because we can get a lot of information out of studying the book of Daniel, but if we lose sight of that one point, that God is sovereign and providential over history, and events are happening for a specific purpose, and if we lose sight of that as believers, then we will miss the entire point of the book of Daniel. So just by way of quick review, in Daniel Daniel chapter 11, beginning at verse 2 through verse 35, everything that has happened from all the way to verse 35 have all happened in past history exactly as God said that they would happen. And finally, from verse 36 through 45, which we will cover in our next study, are all still awaiting future fulfillment. And we can be certain that when these final events happen, they will happen exactly as God said that they will happen. Now, as we begin to examine Daniel chapter 11 and starting at verse 1, I need to first of all remind you that chapter 11 is part of the final vision that's recorded in the book of Daniel that actually began in chapter 10 and includes chapters 10 through 12. And that same angelic being that presented himself in Daniel chapter 10 is the same angel that is still speaking to Daniel here in chapter 11. Now notice the angel says, as we begin to unpack verse 1, he refers to himself as I. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood to confirm him. So I just want you to notice that context, because we're talking about the same angelic being that began speaking to Daniel in chapter 10. Now, remember also in chapter 10, we saw the holy angel and the archangel Michael fighting a supernatural battle in the unseen realm against the demon prince of Persia, in which both sides were battling to influence King Cyrus. That's an important context to keep in mind. Now, in chapter 10, we got a glimpse into the dark side, or the unseen, invisible realm of the spirit world that literally impacts much of what we see occurring here in the natural realm. Or more simply put, much of what we are seeing happening in the natural world was first orchestrated in the spirit realm and then manifested in the natural realm. That is an important context to keep in mind as we explore it at the book of Daniel just in general, but especially these last 3 verses. But even more importantly than that, if you want to be a discerning believer and want to be able to accurately discern the current signs of the time, we must understand this concept, because this same spiritual warfare concept or principle or battle that's happening in the unseen realm that we are observing here in the book of Daniel is exactly the same thing that's happening down here on earth. And so that's such an important thing to keep in mind. And and some of you may think that I'm driving this home a little too much or being a little redundant, but it's vitally important that we understand this, because if we don't understand this particular concept, we will miss, in a large part, much of what God wants us to learn as we begin to unpack these final chapters in the book of Daniel. Now, we saw that in chapter 10, the holy angel and the archangel Michael fighting this supernatural battle in the unseen realm against the demon prince of Persia. And as we notice, and I'm reemphasizing, the battle was to influence King Cyrus the Great, in which we're going to see why as we begin to examine chapter 1. So, as we begin to examine chapter 11. So, let's look here at Daniel chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. And it says, "Also I," remember, that's the same angel or the same angelic being. Many believe that this was a theophany or an Old Testament appearance of Christ. And some believe that it was a different angel, but I'm not going to belabor that point. But I just want to point out, it says, "I, and also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm, to strengthen him." Now I need to stick a pin here, and I won't belabor this much also. But when we talked about when we got into chapter 5, when we examined the story of the fall of Babylon by King Cyrus the Great on that famous night of the handwriting on the wall, we explored who was this individual referred to as Darius the Mede. And there's a lot of controversy because there's no actual extra biblical source or historical source that identifies an individual by the name of Darius during this historical time period. And so critics tried to use this as a way to discredit the entire book of Daniel, but also others believe that or theorize or surmise that Darius was another name for Cyrus, or more probable was the fact that Darius was appointed by Cyrus to over the province of Babylon, because you got to remember the way that the organizational or governmental structure was established or set up in the Persian Empire was that there were territories that they referred to as satraps, and they would appoint governors or leaders or rulers over the particular satraps or territories to rule specific territories. And it is believed that this Darius the Mede was given the area of Babylon. So we'll save that little debate for another time, but I just want to reiterate or just go over this verse again. It says, "Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him." So in other words, if you do an historical study of Cyrus the Great and the feats that he accomplished, and for example, in conquering Babylon in one night, as we can see, the strategy also that we learned about, how he reduced the Euphrates River so his troops could literally walk across the riverbank into the city, basically unopposed. That all of that was organized and orchestrated and given to Cyrus, whether it was in just a subtle hint whispered into his ear. We don't really understand how the message was relayed to Cyrus, but this heavenly angel encouraged Cyrus or gave him the wisdom and the strategy in order to conquer the city of Babylon. So it says, "I stood to confirm and strengthen him." So however he got the wisdom, we know that it was given to him in a supernatural manner from the unseen realm. So now let's look at verse 2. And it says, "And now will I," there's that heavenly angel again, "now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength through his riches He shall, and this is a key verse, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. He shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Now, I want you to notice that verse 2 refers to 4 Persian kings, beginning with King Cyrus. And then there will be 3 others, and the fourth will be richer than them all. And I just want you to notice, of course, it begins with Cyrus the Great from a historical standpoint. And I want you to notice something real interesting about Cyrus, because remember, this holy angel was influencing Cyrus the Great. And so let's look at something in a verse that's recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 23. It says, "Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth has the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem." So he has charged Cyrus, and remember that this prophecy had already been given to Isaiah 200 years before Cyrus was even born. So keep that context in mind. And it says, the Lord God of heaven has given me, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. And of course, keeping in mind that this was after the 70-year period of captivity in Babylon had concluded, and they had been given the decree to be able to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And of course, you can also read about that in the book of Ezra, and you can also read in the book of Nehemiah how they were later allowed to go back and rebuild the city in general. And then, of course, after the death of Cyrus, there was another king by the name of Cambyses II. And then after him was a king Darius the First, or Darius the Great, or Darius he is often called, or sometimes called. And then finally there was Xerxes, who reigned, or Xerxes the First, who reigned from 485 to 465 BC. And he's more famously known in the book of Esther as Ahasuerus. He was rich and very, very influential. Now, I just want to take a moment and stick a pin here just briefly to show you this map of the Persian Empire during this period of time. And I want you to notice over here to the far left, the left corner of the map, you'll see this little small collection of city-states known as Greece. And this to the east of Greece, you'll see this lesser known community called Ionia, which was a Greek province that was located on the far west of the European continent. And so you can see there's just just separated by this area known as the Hellespont that we'll talk about later. But this little community or this Greek community called Ionia or Ionia will play a major role in the battle that is to come. And now remember also that verse 2, the angel said that that fourth king, who we now know was Xerxes, the same Xerxes of the book of Esther, he said will eventually come to stir up the realm of Greece. And we know for a fact that this actually happened from a historical perspective, because Xerxes launched a period of what we call the Greco-Persian Wars. And of course, these wars would eventually lead to the conquering of the Persians by the Greeks. Now, what were the Greco-Persian Wars? The Persian Wars, sometimes known as the Greco-Persian Wars, were a series of conflicts between Greek city-states and the Persian Empire, beginning in 502 BC and running some 50 years until 449 BC. Now, this collision between the fractious political world of the Greeks and the enormous empire of the Persians began when Cyrus the Great conquered the Greek inhabited region of Ionia in 547 BC. And of course, if you recall, when I was showing that map previously, and I pointed out that Ionia will become a major player in this up and coming Greek and Persian conflict. Now, struggling to control the independent-minded cities of Ionia, the Persians appointed tyrants to rule each of them. This would prove to be the source of much trouble for the Greeks and the Persians alike, because this would lead to a series of major battles between the Greeks and the Persians, because the Ionians revolted against the Persian tyrants, which led Xerxes to launch a massive invasion of Greece, particularly Athens and Sparta, who were the two biggest city-states and the strongest and most influential city-states of the Greek region at this particular time. Now, of all the battles that took place between Greece and Sparta during this time, of which there were several, by the way, but there were two that are the most memorable to those of us here in the 21st century. The first of those being the Battle of Marathon, which occurred in 490 BC. And interestingly, the Battle of Marathon is actually still commemorated today every time a marathon race is ran. This is because once the Greeks defeated the Persians, and this was of course the very first or the first of the major victories that Greece had over the Persians when they, launched their series of invasions. But here, the Battle of Marathon is famous today because after or the Greeks won the battle, um, they sent a courier by the name of Phidippides to run to Athens in order to let them know that they had victory, or they had attained victory over the Persians. And this distance that Phidippides ran was 26 miles from the Bay of Marathon to Athens. And of course, it was this 26 miles in which a marathon race is today. And it's because of this distance between Marathon and Athens. And of course, Phidippides also is famous because he ran nonstop this 26 miles. And this, of course, one of the things that is not noted or not commonly thought of when you think about Phidippides, but you got to remember that this was after he fought in heavy armor all day long. And then after that, he ran this 26 miles from Marathon to Athens. Of course, he ran into the city square yelling, "Victory, victory." Or in other words, the word was Nike, Nike, or which was the Greek word for victory. And of course, I believe is where the company Nike got its name, or took its name from the Greek word for victory. And of course, Phidippides is said to have dropped dead from exhaustion soon thereafter. Now, arguably the most well-known of these battles between Greece and Persia to those living here in the 21st century would be, of course, the Battle of Thermopylae, or what it is often referred to as the Battle of the 300, in which 300 Spartans, led by their king Leonidas, held up a major, mighty, overwhelming Persian force for 3 whole days. And of course, this allowed the Athenians actually to evacuate Athens. And even though the Persians eventually defeated the 300 and made their way to Athens and actually burned Athens to the ground, there were very few casualties because the exploits of the 300 Spartans allowed Athens time to evacuate. And because Athens was very rich, because just before this they had discovered several major silver mines, which was a major boost to the Athenian economy, and they were actually able to rebuild the city in quick order. But following the Battle of Thermopylae, there were several other battles between the Persians and the Greeks eventually prevailed. There were naval battles and also land battles, and the Greeks actually, under the lead of a general by the name of Themistocles, was able to defeat the Persian navy, which was, of course, again, an overwhelming naval force, but they were able to strategize and defeat the Persian navy. And they also defeated the Persians on the ground in subsequent battles. And this made or caused the Persians to flee back to Europe, and they never invaded the Greek homeland again after that. And of course, what all of this did, though, was set the stage for what was about to happen about 100 years later, because a mighty king is going to arise and conquer the Persian Empire. So with that background, let's look at verse 3. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. These events, of course, set the stage for that famous fulfillment of Daniel chapter 8 of the ram and the goat. And of course, we know that goat was Alexander the Great, and that horn between its two eyes represented the mighty king that will arise. And of course, that king was Alexander. Alexander conquered the Persian Empire in less than 10 years. And of course, he took control of the Greek army at the age of 20, when his father, Philip of Macedon, was assassinated by his own bodyguard. Alexander took control of the army at the age of 20, and in less than 10 years conquered the mighty Persians. And most of the time, in fact, every time, he was massively outnumbered by the Persians, but yet was able to defeat. And remember that Alexander was being controlled and empowered and influenced by the mighty Prince of Grecia, or that demonic supernatural spirit of the unseen world that was in control over the nation of Greece, that the scripture calls him the Prince of Persia. And you got to keep that in mind. A very important point to keep in mind. And Alexander, but if you study his exploits, he was to this very day, that military schools around the world still study Alexander, and including places like West Point. They study Alexander in some of his battle tactics and some of his strategies and some of the things that he did in order to overwhelm such an overwhelming force as the Persians in such a short period of time. Now, just to do a quick review, of course, we got to remember that what happened to Alexander at the age of 32, I believe it was a month before his 33rd birthday, he mysteriously died. And as it says here in verse 8, as for the broken horn, remember that in verse 7 it says that mighty horn shall be broken. In Daniel chapter 8 and verse 7. And in verse 8 it says, as the broken horn and as for the broken horn, and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its own power. And of course, we know from history, as we studied and as we looked at Daniel chapter 8, that four of Alexander's top generals split the empire four ways, and those four generals were Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander. And of course, none of them was able to have the same type of anointing, the same type of gifting, the same leadership ability that Alexander had. And so they began to a series of civil wars among these four generals, known as the Wars of the Diadochi, that we'll look at here in a moment. Now, in these first four verses of chapter 11, what the angelic messenger is literally doing is giving Daniel a summary of Daniel chapter 8. Basically, in four verses, he summarized the first half of Daniel chapter 8. And then he goes on to give more progressive details of the remainder of Daniel chapter 8. And so this is a progressive revelation. Remember, we talked about that term, a progressive revelation that we're going to be given here in Daniel chapter 11 of the revelation that was initially given in Daniel chapter 8. And so what did we learn in the first half of Daniel chapter 8? Well, first of all, it was that vision between the ram and the he-goat. So Daniel saw a two-headed ram. And of course, we know that that two-headed ram was the Medo-Persian Empire. They literally came to power on that famous night of the handwriting on the wall in Daniel chapter 5, which happened in 539 BC. Then Daniel saw, rather, in Daniel chapter 8, a one-horn goat. And we know that that horn was, or that goat was the Greek Empire, and that one single horn represented Alexander the Great. And of course, Alexander went on in just less than 10 years, conquered the Persian Empire with the final battle being the Battle of Gaugamela, which occurred in 331 BC. But of course, Alexander would go on to conquer more. He actually made it all the way into India before his troops began to kind of mutiny a little bit, because they had been campaigning for over 10 years, and some of them was ready to go back home. So we learned that in our study of Daniel chapter 8. But then after that, the Bible says that that little horn was broken. Alexander died at a very young age. He died at the age of 32, just 1 month before his 33rd birthday. And of course, he died in 323 BC, just 2 years after he conquered the Persian Empire. Then his empire was divided amongst his four top generals that we pointed out just a moment ago. And this happened, of course, this led to, rather, the final two of those four empires, which was the Ptolemy part and the Seleucid part. And those two generals actually would reign supreme ultimately. And of course, this would lead to the rise of that Seleucid king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes that was introduced to us in chapter 8, but we're going to actually get more progressive revelatory details about him as we continue in our study of Daniel chapter 9. And of course, he came to power in 168 BC. Now, one of the more interesting stories about Alexander's final moments was that just prior to him taking his last breath, while he was on his deathbed, his generals surrounded him. And of course, his four top generals who would end up splitting the kingdom were Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And you remember also that it is said in verse 4 that it would not go to his posterity, which means that none of his descendants would be able to claim the empire or claim the throne. And so what we'll have going forward is that from beginning at verse 5 through 35, will cover the next 200 years of Middle Eastern history leading up to the time of the Romans. And what's going to be interesting is that these events was prophesied hundreds of years before the events actually took place, and none of the players involved in the story was ever even born at the time that this prophecy was given. And so that is another indication that God is in absolute control over world history. His providence rather is unquestioned, and this is ultimate proof that the Bible truly is the Word of God, because as we begin to explore beginning in verse 5, all of these events took place precisely as this heavenly messenger said that they would. So what happened in the decades following the death of Alexander is that those four top generals fought a series of wars for control of the empire. And those wars were called the Diadochi, or the Wars of Succession, or the successors of Alexander fought over control of the territory. So to summarize, on June 10th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. And although historians have debated the exact cause of his death, most agree that the empire he built was left without adequate leadership, for there was no clear successor or heir. And of course, remember, not to his posterity was what the angel said in verse 4. Now, the military commanders who had followed Alexander over a decade across the sands of Asia were left to fight each other over their piece of the territorial pie. And of course, this was the Wars of Succession, or also called the Diadochi Wars. Now, what followed these wars were decades of intense rivalry. In the end, two dominant dynasties emerged that remained in power until the time of the Romans. And these two dominant dynasties were the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, or what's going to be referred as we progress further in our reading of chapter 11 is the king of the north, which were the Seleucids, and the king of the south, which was the Ptolemies. So now, just to provide a little bit of historic background, because understanding this history, because we're reading these events after these events had taken place, and so just to get a little bit of historical background, let me just talk a little bit about the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Now, the Ptolemies ruled Palestine, or the area of Palestine, from 323 BC to 198 BC. After the death of Alexander in 323 BC, his generals divided the empire into four parts, two of which was Egypt, Ptolemy controlled Egypt, and Syria, which was controlled by Seleucid. Palestine, with much of Syria and Phoenicia, fell to Ptolemy I, who established himself as satrap in Egypt that same year, and adapted the title king in 304 BC. And after the death of Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for 300 years. And remember, the Ptolemaic dynasty would just refer to all the descendants of Ptolemy I. And of course, the last, and this is interesting, and that is the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty was, of course, that famous queen by the name of Cleopatra. Next, the Seleucids ruled Palestine from 198 BC to 142 BC. Antiochus invaded Egypt in 170 or 169 BC, returning to Syria by way of Jerusalem, where he and his army despoiled the temple of all its wealth. 2 years later, after his humiliating expulsion from the gate of Egypt by the Roman legate, he sent a financial official to exact taxes from the cities of Judea. Antiochus official attacked the city of Jerusalem by guile and largely destroyed it. This imposition was followed by an open attack on religious practice in which many rites were forbidden, or many of the Jewish rituals were forbidden. And finally, in December 168 BC, the abomination of desolation took place, namely the altar of Zeus was set up in the temple in Jerusalem, and a pig was sacrificed on the altar. It was this, above all, that summoned forth the resistance of the sons of the aged priest Matthias. Thus began the Maccabean revolt led by Judas Maccabeus, and we may talk a little bit about that as we get further into this study. Now, with that historical background in mind, and keep in mind, in order to really fully get a full grasp of the remainder of chapter 11, that's important that you keep that historical context in mind, and that you also keep in mind that this was given by this heavenly angel hundreds of years before any of the subsequent events ever took place. So that's important to keep in mind. So as we look at verse 5, it says, and the king of the south, and the king of the south, of course, was Ptolemy, because the Ptolemaic dynasty controlled the south, controlled Egypt. So the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her also, and he that strengthened her in these times. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, so let's just examine, first of all, by taking a look at this king's daughter and who exactly are the players referred to in this verse. First of all, in this context, it mentions the king of the south and it mentions the king of the north. And again, just for clarity's sake, you always keep in mind when we see this term throughout the remainder of this chapter, when it refers to the king of the south, the king of the north, it's referring to Ptolemy and Seleucus and their subsequent dynasties over the next couple hundred years. So Ptolemy the First, who again was one of Alexander's four leading generals, took control after Alexander's death, took control of Egypt from 323 BC to 282 BC. As a matter of fact, it is said that Ptolemy the First actually hijacked Alexander's funeral procession and hijacked his body and took it to Egypt, where there it stayed for the next several hundred years. So that's an interesting little side note. But Ptolemy the First was king of the south. He was ruler, and his subsequent lineage, his subsequent dynasties controlled the area of Egypt up until the time of the Roman conquest, where Cleopatra and Antony committed suicide shortly after the Battle of Actium. So that's another little historical little side note. But it was his dynasty that controlled that area, and it was the Ptolemy the First who was the king of the south, along with his dynasty, along with his descendants. So remember in verse 6 it says, "For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement." So now who are these players? The king's daughter referred to here was Bernice. And we know this historically, and it's recorded in Josephus and other historical, non-biblical historical sources. But Bernice was the daughter of Ptolemy Philadelphus, or Ptolemy II, who was the king of Egypt. The agreement was a proposed peace treaty that called for Antiochus II to marry Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy II. This was to, quote, make an agreement or to put an end to the wars and discords, to make peace and to cultivate friendships and to strengthen alliances and to confirm each other in their kingdoms. But then it goes on to say, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, or in other words, she will not be able to unite the two kingdoms and secure the peace of them, which was the main objective in the first place. But Antiochus, who married Bernice, already had a wife, a powerful and influential woman named Laodice. She did not take kindly to being divorced. She therefore organized a successful conspiracy. She managed to have both Bernice and her infant son, whom she had born to Antiochus, assassinated. Not long afterward, the king himself was poisoned to death in 247 BC, and the pro-Leodis party engineered a coup that put her in power as a regent queen. The prophecy literally was fulfilled concerning Bernice, that she would be handed over. Now keep this in mind. None of these players were even born at the time that this prophecy was given, but as it played out in real-time history, the events occurred and took place exactly as described in or by the heavenly messenger as he was given this revelation to the prophet Daniel. So notice what it says in verse 7. But out of a branch of her roots, her, that was Bernice, keep that in mind, the her was Bernice, out of the branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate. The branch of her roots was referring to somebody in her family tree, somebody from her family tree, which shall come with an army and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north and shall deal against him and shall prevail. In other words, one of her descendants is going to, not her descendant, but one of her, somebody from her family tree, somebody, a relative of hers, somebody from her immediate family line is going to take revenge on the king of the north. And of course, this is exactly what happened, because this was person that was ended up being Ptolemy III, who was Bernice's brother, who in order to avenge his sister's death marched with a great army against Seleucus Salicanus. This war waged from 246 to 241 BC, where he took some of the best places, including all of Asia, from Mount Taurus to India, and he returned to Egypt with an immense amount of booty. And this is exactly what happened in real time. So what I just described is what literally happened in real time in response to this verse that was written hundreds of years prior to the events ever taking place. So notice again, but out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army and shall enter the fortress of the king of the north and shall deal against him and shall prevail. And as we just saw, that's exactly what took place in real-time history, which again, this is just an amazing, another amazing example, which we will see actually played out throughout the remainder of chapter 11. And again, I want to just point out also that you have to now be able to begin to see why many historians and Bible prophecy scholars view Daniel 11 as the most thorough, the most complete, and the most complex of all the prophecies recorded in the entirety of the Old Testament. And as we begin to see examples of why, this is the belief system, because all of these events played out so precisely, and it's just so many of these events that occurred and were prophesied and were fulfilled with such amazing precision and accuracy years after the prophecies were given. So this again points to the amazing, infallibility of the Word of God. And shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. Of course, again, this was Ptolemy the third. So verse 10 says, but his sons, now these are, of course, are the sons of Seleucus Callinicus, who were Seleucus and Antiochus, who was the Antiochus, the elder of whom Seleucus succeeded him to the throne. So that's important to keep that in mind. But his sons shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with rage and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. And of course, again, what we have here is what literally took place in history, in which the sons of Seleucus Callinicus, by the way, he had two sons. One was named Antiochus the Great, or Antiochus the Third, and the other one was named Seleucus. And of course, his two sons set out to take back much of the territory that his father, or their father, had lost to the king of the south, or to the Ptolemies, or to Egypt. But the Seleucus eventually died, and this, of course, left Antiochus, or the third, or Antiochus the Great, he was called in history, to prosecute the battle against the Egyptians alone. Verse 13, for the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of the people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land. The glorious land, of course, is referring to the nation of Israel, or Palestine, which by his hand shall be consumed. And so in short, what you have discussed here in these last three verses is that it describes the eventual wresting away of the Holy Land from the Egyptian control by Antiochus the Great, or the king of the north. In other words, the Seleucids will eventually wrestle control of the area of Palestine away from the king of the north, or the Ptolemies. And basically, this is what you have described here. And this is exactly what happened in history. Now, this map that we have here gives a perfect visual of what's happening between these two powers, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And if you can see, of course, that the south, the Ptolemy controlled the south. He's the king of the south. You can also see that the Seleucids is the king of the north. But what's interesting is what stands between the south, or the Egypt and this area of Syria controlled by the Seleucids. And of course, what stand in the way is Israel, which was the buffer. So who controlled this area? It was major as to who was going to be have the dominant, hold the dominant hand, because Israel stood right in the middle of these two powers. And this is where a lot of the conflict is centered around, because you had to pass through Israel, whether you were traveling north or south, you had to pass through Israel. And so you had to control this territory. And this would give you the dominant hand and the dominant control. And of course, the nation of Israel would suffer tremendously in the coming years because of this particular geographical issue. Verse 17, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. After this he shall turn his face unto the isle, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. And of course, what's happening here in this verse, or in these passages, is that in order to get an advantage, or hoping rather to gain an advantage over Egypt, Antiochus the Great, or Antiochus the Third, gave his daughter Cleopatra, and of course there were many Cleopatras that went by that name, so we're not talking about the Mark Antony Cleopatra, but this is earlier Cleopatra. He gave her in marriage to Ptolemy V in 195 BC. But Antiochus' daughter sided with her husband, and so Antiochus gained no advantage, and he lost a battle against the Romans after that. So after his defeat to the Romans, he had to surrender his entire elephant brigade and his entire navy and 20 selected hostages. Finally, he was obliged to pay an indemnity of 15,000 or 20,000 talents over a period of several years. Antiochus' second son, who was named after him, was among the 20 hostages given to Rome, where he spent the formative years of his life. He later became the dreaded persecutor of the Jews, known as Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. So let's just go back and take a quick review, because as you've probably noticed, there's a lot that's going on here. And of course, I'm just doing a thumbnail over the actual history, because it's actually a lot more intrigue that went on than I'm able to portray in this particular study. But by 198 BC, the Seleucids had gained control of Israel and Judea when the Seleucid Emperor Antiochus III defeated the Ptolemaic Egyptians in a battle and annexed Judea into his empire. So now Judea is under control of the kings of the north, or the Seleucids. For some time, Antiochus III left the Jews to relative autonomy, but he eventually decided that the Jews should assimilate to the Greek way of life known as Hellenization. And so a campaign of Hellenization was begun. This process of forced assimilation into Greek culture only became worse for the Jews with the ascension in 176 BC of Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, who refused to allow any religious exceptions or exemptions for the Jews as his father had. It is during the reign of Antiochus IV that the Maccabees rose to prominence. And of course, enter into the scene the infamous Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a great persecutor of the Jews, and as we have learned before, was that little horn in Daniel chapter 8, and also was a type or a forerunner of the Antichrist that is to come in the future, who brought about the abomination of desolation when he desecrated the holy temple. Verse 20 says, Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And essentially what we have here in verse 20 is that the 12-year reign of Antiochus III's eldest son, Seleucus IV, was marked by heavy taxes throughout all of Palestine. Seleucus was eventually poisoned to death by his minister. And of course, that entered into the scene or raised or opened the door, of course, for Antiochus Epiphanes to enter the scene. So from here, beginning at verse 21 and all the way through verse 24, what we have is these verses document the tyrannical oppression of the Jewish people by Antiochus Epiphanes, who by force tried to make the Jewish people forego their religion in favor of all things Greek. This was a time of the Maccabees, who raised, or rather who resisted Hellenization, and of course Antiochus Epiphanes, they resisted him as well. They saw the worst during this period of time, saw the worst tyranny, of course, in Jewish history. Antiochus borrowed the surname Epiphanes, which means God manifest, to indicate that he was a manifestation of the deity. Strongly reinforcing the tradition of the Seleucids, he required men to worship him as the Olympian Zeus. And so Antiochus went on to viciously slaughter Jews who continued to obey biblical instructions, and he desecrated the temple, of course, as we have seen over in chapter 8, and we'll see again as we continue to read. So beginning at verse 20, it says, And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. So now, just a little bit of background on Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. He came to power in 175 BC. This was a 137 year of the kingdom of the Greeks, or after the Greeks, or after Alexander, 137 years after Alexander initially conquered the Persians. He invaded Egypt and he defeated Ptolemy VI. Recalled from Egypt by Rome, then he made Israel a buffer state. He called himself Epiphanes, or God manifest, or the illustrious one. But the Jews called him Epinomes, or the madman. So just a little bit more historical context about Antiochus, because he was a major character, a major player in this Daniel 11 prophecy. Again, he dedicated in the Jewish temple of Zeus, he dedicated the temple to Zeus, rather. He sacrificed a pig and other unclean animals on the altar. He forbid Jews from keeping the Sabbath or other festivals, and forbid circumcision under the pain of death. He required celebration of his birthday once a month with dedication to Dionysus. He required the people to prove their abandonment of Judaism by sacrificing a pig and eating a portion of that sacrifice. And he executed Jews by the thousands. So, verse 22, And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds even for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to a battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that fed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both of these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Then shall he return into his land with the great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. And at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. For the ships of Shittim, or of course, this is this new rising power called Rome, shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return, and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsook the holy covenant. Now I need to stick a pin right here in order to talk about an incident that occurred that was in direct fulfillment of this particular prophecy that says, for the ships of Shittim, or the ships of Rome, shall come against him. And this literally happened in actual history that's documented in several historical sources. And what happened was Antiochus, was on a full march to besiege Alexandria, Egypt. And he was within 7 miles of Alexandria when he heard that the ships had arrived there from Rome with legates from the Senate. He went to salute them, and they delivered to him letters of the Senate, from the Senate, which he was commanded on the pain of displeasure of the Roman people to put an end to the war against the Egyptians. Antiochus said he would go and consult with his friends or his administrators, on which Publius, who was the head of the legates who was there to warn Antiochus, took out a staff and instantly drew a circle around Antiochus on the sand where Antiochus stood at that moment, and commanded him not to pass out of that circle till he had given a definitive answer. In other words, this is where the term drawing a line in the sand literally comes from. Antiochus, was intimidated, and he said he would do whatever the Senate enjoined. And in a few days after, he began his march and returned to Syria. Now, mind you, in order to get to Syria, he had to pass through Palestine. So, in verse 31, and the arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And such as they do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. Now I'm going to conclude the first half of our study of Daniel chapter 11 by looking at verses 34 and 35, which actually speaks to the Maccabean revolt that will eventually gain independence from the Seleucids and from Antiochus. And so let's look at verse 34 and verse 35. which will speak to that future event that we know in hindsight literally took place in past history. Verse 34 says, now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen, in other words, aided with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So again, as I pointed out, these two verses points to the Maccabean revolt, or in Hebrew is the Hasmonean revolt, which was a Jewish rebellion led by the Maccabees against the Seleucid Empire and against Hellenistic influence on Jewish life. The main phase of the revolt lasted from 167 to 160 BC and ended with the Seleucids in control of Judea, but conflict between the Maccabees, Hellenized Jews, and the Seleucids continued until 134 BC, with the Maccabees eventually attaining their independence. Now, just as I close today's study, I just want to reiterate some practical applications that I think we need to get out of this study of just Daniel in general, but in particular, the study of Daniel chapter 11. The first 35 verses in Daniel chapter 11 are a remarkable example of pre-written history. Remember that I mentioned earlier in our studies that prophecy is history written in advance, or pre-written history. So in other words, these are remarkable examples of pre-written history and the literal fulfillment of that pre-written history. This prophecy is so utterly detailed and accurate that it staggers those who study it. There are approximately, and I need you to get this, there are approximately 135, let me say that again. There are approximately 135 fulfilled prophecies in the first 35 verses that all have been literally fulfilled in world history. The intricate details of the conflicts between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and their subsequent fulfillments shows the specificity of these prophecies, which is so extensive that skeptics of the Bible had to change the date of Daniel so that it would not be so blatantly supernatural. They claim that Daniel was written during the time of the Maccabees between 168 and 134 BC, or after many of the events actually took place. That's how they try to justify the fact that all of these prophecies happen with such precision. They try to deny the element of pre-written history, or the element of divine revelation or prophecy fulfillment, and they just can't accept that concept, because then they would have to conclude that it could only have been written by a supernatural God that can see the end from the beginning. We find the career of a single king of the north, Antiochus Epiphanes, in verses 31 through 35, or I'm sorry, in verses 21 through 35. He is also the little horn of Daniel 8, who persecuted Israel and set up the abomination of desolation in the temple of Jerusalem. And finally, Daniel also predicts in verses 32 through 35, as I pointed out earlier, the rise of the Maccabees, who revolted against Antiochus. And of course, that if you do a study on that Maccabean revolt, you'll see that the Maccabees actually undertook a guerrilla warfare tactic, and it was strategic over time. Like they would do hit and run tactics, and this eventually wore down Antiochus's forces, and they would eventually be able to gain victory and independence over the Seleucids. And it happened while Antiochus was on campaign in Syria, and when he found out that his forces had been defeated, he actually dropped dead, which was also a fulfillment of something that was recorded about him in Daniel chapter 8. So it's just such amazing detail that's given to us here about the future of Israel, which is already past. And so we're going to begin next study, and we're going to look at the remainder of Daniel chapter 11, and we're going to look beginning at verse 36, and we're going to see details that have not yet been fulfilled, details that are pointing to the Antichrist as yet futuristic. And we have to be able to conclude that if all of the prophecies between verses 1 through verses 35 has happened with such precision, then we have to conclude then that the remainder of the prophecy that has not yet been fulfilled will in the same way be literally fulfilled with great precision as the first 35 verses were fulfilled. So with that, I'm going to close today's lesson, and I hope you enjoyed our study for today, and I hope you get back, and we'll look forward to our next study when we'll pick up with verse 36, which will be talking about the future Antichrist and the last days. So until next time, may God bless.